Does anyone like you? Do you have any friends? Do you have anyone that loves you? Or more, or maybe even more profoundly, are there people for whom you make sacrifices? Even if the goal is, say, the maximization of your success that comes at the expense of other people, that means that your definition of success is thoroughly flawed. That's all it means.
Your book is called We Who Wrestle with God. And it's my belief and suspicion that there's a lot of people wrestling with God at the moment. And when I say the word God, I don't necessarily mean some man in the sky with a beard. What I really mean is a greater meaning, a greater sense of meaning. The world feels like, and you speak to this in the book, that it's gotten more and more individualistic, and there's consequence to that.
Fractionated is another way of thinking about it, right? Because you can think about it as individualistic, and that's a positive spin, so to speak. But alienated, isolated, and fractionated is the accompaniment to that. See, I think the case is that the liberal experiment in individualism only works when the conservative foundation is in place, right? If you aggregate people together and they share enough fundamental values, especially of a particular sort, then you can concentrate on the individual and individual freedom. But there's a lot of preconditions for that. And, the Scottish liberals, so the ones who really established Western liberalism as a philosophical and political movement, they knew that. It was individual liberty, Judeo-Christian substructure, and that was an assumption. Now, the problem with modern liberalism is that underlying foundation has become extremely shaky, and everyone feels it. That's what the culture war is about, fundamentally. And that fact is invalidating the fractionated liberal experiment. It's partly because we have the wrong conception of identity, fundamentally. Identity is a hierarchical structure. So we kind of think that you end at your boundaries as an individual, but you don't, because, well, you're probably not going to want to be alone. So then let's say you're married. Okay, so now your identity as a husband, that's a social identity. And then you have an identity as a father. That's a social identity. Then you have an identity as a member of your community and a member of your city and a member of your state and a member of your nation. And then you're involved in a metaphysical endeavor that constitutes the foundation for the nation, let's say. That would be one nation under God. That's one way of thinking about it. Or you could think about it as the self-evident truths that underlie the state. Your identity exists at all those levels. And then your mental health isn't something you carry around in your head. It's the harmony that exists or doesn't exist between all those levels. And that isn't how liberal individualists think about identity at all. And that's because they were, for a long time, fortunate enough so all those other strata were in place.
So where do we find ourselves now if we don't have that hierarchy and we aren't held in place by all those layers and sort of social and, I guess, family identities?
Adrift in a storm, alone. So look, here's an interesting fact. So psychologists who are statistically minded, they're called psychometricians. They're psychologists who are obsessed, research psychologists who are obsessed with measurement and concept definition, spent a lot of time aggregating concepts. These were, in some ways, what they were doing was equivalent to the development of early large language models. So psychologists were at the forefront of that on the statistical side. Words that we use to describe people clump together. So, for example, if you're extroverted, you're social and you're happy, you're enthusiastic. Okay, so those clump together. If you're anxious, you also tend to be frustrated, disappointed, grief-stricken, and in pain. All the negative emotions clump. Words associated with your empathy aggregate. Words associated with your dutifulness aggregate, and so do words associated with creativity. Those are the 5 fundamental dimensions of temperament. One of the words that clumps with negative emotion is self-consciousness, which means that self-consciousness is so tightly associated with suffering that they're not conceptually distinguishable, which means, literally, the more you think about yourself, the more miserable you are. And it makes sense when you understand how social people are. We're so social that you can take the most antisocial human beings imaginable, so psychopathic criminals, and you can punish them by putting them in solitary confinement. That's how social human beings are. And so your mental health is way more dependent on your nesting within a social structure than on your, say, the internal coherence of your belief systems. In fact, I think it's hardly at all dependent on the internal consistency of your coherence of your belief systems. It's more like, does anyone like you? Do you have any friends? Do you have anyone that loves you? Or more, or maybe even more profoundly, are there people for whom you make sacrifices? Right? That's it's relevant to the topic of this book, obviously, because the relationship with the divine in the stories that I'm detailing in this book, most of them are Old Testament stories, the relationship with the divine is a sacrificial relationship. The divine is that to which sacrifice is directed. Well, if you get married, it's a sacrificial offering because you sacrifice your potential relationship with all other women to that woman.
How does one transform that if one is experiencing envy of another's call to adventure, or envy of another one's path or success or reward from God, the universe, wherever it's coming from? How does one transform, purify, and rid themselves of that envy? What does one do with envy?
There are part of what has historically constituted religious practice is an answer to that question. So the first would be, you could practice gratitude, and you could make the case that if you're not screaming in agony because you're on fire right now, you have lots of things to be fortunate about. And people who have passed through extremely harrowing experiences, they often learn that. It's like, oh, the sorts of things that I thought were terrible are almost negligible. And there's so many good things happening to me all the time around me that are invisible to me, maybe because of my arrogance, that I'm just blind to them. So the practice of gratitude, that's a standard religious exercise, I would say, across the domains of valid religious systems. What else? Humility. So the thing about that, one of the things that distinguishes Cain from Abel is that when Cain fails, he thinks it's God's fault or society or other people, or it's externalized blame. When Abel fails, he learns. And that's the proper sacrificial attitude, because so for example, if you're a man and you're getting nowhere with women, it's very easy for you to become extremely hostile to women, which is not going to help you out much, generally speaking, in the relationship market. And you can certainly understand why that might be, because if you've had 50 encounters with women you're attracted to, and every single one of them resulted in maybe not only rejection, but contemptuous rejection, you can certainly understand why you might conclude from that there's something seriously wrong with women. But you could flip that and you could presume that by definition, if you're failing in that regard, there's some changes that should be made. And it really does depend on your initial stance with regard to the situation. One of the things that comes through very clearly with regards to the upward aiming Israelites, they're not all upward aiming, but the upward aiming ones in the Old Testament, is whenever a cataclysm visits them, they assume it's their fault. And that's a hell of a thing to take onto yourself, right? It's, if I'm failing, it's my fault. And you can certainly understand why that's difficult, because a certain amount of misery seems to visit people arbitrarily. But
there's almost no failure, regardless of how arbitrary, that you can't learn from. And there isn't anything better that you can do with failure, no matter how unjust, than to learn from it. And so as a general attitude, how did I go wrong here is a hyper useful existential stance, right? And it's also a bulwark against hopelessness because, even if it was 95% situational and 5% you, if you adjusted that 5%, maybe that'd be enough so that the next time that situation arises, you'd come out on the positive side of it. And you're also not a torment to other people then, because your general question is, how am I insufficient? And that also gives you something to do because, man, trying to rectify your own insufficiency, that'll keep you busy for the rest of your life. And that's a good thing, right? That's a meaningful pursuit. And you will experience it that way.
Working on your own insufficiencies.
Yeah, well, it's an inexhaustible source of possibility, right? Because there's always, you could be better at something than you are, no matter how good you are at something, and no matter how many dimensions you're doing that analysis in simultaneously, right? It's like a horizon of opportunity in some ways. That's the flip side of it. Your insufficiencies, the flip side of your insufficiencies are the opportunities that growth in those dimensions would represent. And that's a good way of looking at the world.
What's the insufficiency that lets us down the most? Is there one that stands above all others?
Pride. That's the classical answer from the Judeo-Christian perspective anyways. Pride and arrogance, that would be something like the presumption that you're right and that you're above it all, that you're on top. And you could see that as well, first of all, it's something very annoying to other people. So that's a problem, given that you have to put up with them. And it's also an impediment to learning, right? Because to be open to learning does mean, at least to some degree, always asking, well, what am I doing wrong? What do I have to give up? What do I have to let go of? What do I have to transform? That can be very painful. But so pride, that's one. That's a major one. Hedonism, that's a problem, and that's a kind of immaturity. So that's that desire for immediate gratification at the expense of other people, at the expense of you in the long run, right? At the expense of the general future. And so that's a very difficult thing to overcome. I mean, a lot of what you do when you're socializing children is you're trying to encourage them to become capable of integrating their various hedonistic desires so they don't conflict with one another, so that they can find their gratification in the long run in a manner that's commensurate with the needs and wants of other people. And it takes 20 years to socialize a child to become a full-fledged adult, and it's not like the process ends there. It's a very complicated process of integration and self-regulation. And it is upward. And why? Why is it better? Well, even if the goal is gratification, if one strategy allows 20 repetitions of gratification and the other strategy offers one gratification followed by regret and catastrophic failure, it seems pretty obvious, even by the standards of gratification, that the first strategy is better than the second.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
So the iteration element of it is crucial. Now, is this a long-term playable game? Better. Is this the kind of long-term playable, sustainable game that I would like to engage in voluntarily and maybe bring others aboard equally voluntarily? That's a good ethical question. It's also extremely practically valuable. We were talking before this began about the utility that you found in putting together around you a very functional team. Well, a functional team is composed of people playing the same game and all doing it full-heartedly and voluntarily. Yeah, well, so that's an optimal solution, even if the goal is, say, the maximization of your success. Your success that comes at the expense of other people, that means that your definition of success is thoroughly flawed. That's all it means. That's especially true if the world isn't a zero-sum game, and I don't see any evidence that it is. There's no reason that your victory, unless you're envious and spiteful, sadistic even, there's absolutely no reason that your victory has to come at the expense of someone else. I don't think men are encouraged. I think they're discouraged actively right from day one. Whether that makes them have a harder time than women is very difficult to say. I think those things are best judged on an individual level. I mean, I was thinking about, and then if you think about it historically, well, it's 2019. Well, imagine 1919. Well, that would have been 4 years of a terrible war with tens of thousands of people dead, and then the Spanish influenza. It could be a hell of a lot worse than it is now. And so we have our problems. I think the most serious is a form of strange political polarization that threatens, to some degree, that seems to threaten the stability of our political systems and the civility of our society. But, it depends on your grounds of comparison. It's not like we're starving. It's not like we're in the middle of a plague. There's no civil war. Things could be a hell of a lot worse. But there's a pernicious social viciousness that's emerged over the last 10 years that I think is disheartening to people, and it would be nice if that would dissipate, and perhaps it will. Perhaps people will gain their senses and stop causing unnecessary trouble. I mean, it's not surprising to me to some degree. We have a technical problem. And the technical problem fundamentally is that the birth control pill radically altered the relationship between men and women. It turned women into creatures who did not know who they were. And unsurprisingly, because an entire plethora of new options opened up, and it destabilized the relationship between men and women for the same reason. And it's not easy to understand the new dynamic that should or could emerge as a consequence of women having voluntary control over their reproduction. So to me, it's in large part the male-female issue is the upheaval of something that's the equivalent of a major biological mutation. So we've had 40 years to figure that out. It's like we haven't figured it out. I think that we've also compounded that by doing almost nothing but lying to young women, because that's all we do to young women. We tell them that, well, first of all, that career is the most important thing in life, there is no evidence whatsoever that that's true. If you look at standard public opinion polls, you find that 75% of people regard their family and their friends as the most important part of their lives.
Men as well.
Men as well, yes. It's the social, well, Jesus, most careers aren't careers, they're jobs. How many bloody people have a career? And even if you have a career, what makes you think it's worth giving up a family for? What are you going to do when you're 50 and 60 and 70 and you're alone? And believe me, there's going to be plenty of people facing that. And, so it's no solution. And to tell young women that their fundamental orientation in life is going to be a career is a complete lie. It's not only not true conceptually, because that isn't how people are oriented, but it's untrue demographically, because what happens to the vast majority of women, even professional women, is that when they hit their 30s, their early 30s, they cut back radically on their career commitments and start to focus on having a family. And no bloody wonder, because, well, you better get at it. That's the first thing, because 30's pushing it. And second, well, what makes you think that your job is so all-consuming and meaningful? You mostly get paid to do things that you don't want to do, which is why you get paid for them. There's this tiny fraction of people who have hyper-interesting creative careers, and they're a tremendously tiny proportion of the population. And even those people, it isn't obvious to me, have lives that are better served by their extraordinary careers than they would be served by normative family arrangements. And you need people, you need an intimate partner, you need children and grandchildren. These aren't optional. And to tell young women that that's part of the propaganda of the oppressive patriarchy is, you could hardly do them a more cruel disservice. And they will discover that when they're 30. It's why the law firms lose all their women in their 30s. They all go and take part-time jobs or work 9 to 5. They're not interested in the C-suite. Do you know how goddamn hard you have to work to be a C-suite executive? It's 80 hours a week. I know some insane men that work in the C-suite, and the mystery isn't why there are few women in the C-suite. The mystery is why there are any men at all in the C-suite, because all they do is work. And they have a tremendous amount of responsibility. And you think, well, they have many millions of dollars and they have their yachts and their freedom. And, that's trust fund people or people who are benefiting from unearned oil revenue in the Middle East, the parasitical rich, let's say, who aren't productive. But most of the people who occupy themselves in business have thousands of employees that they're responsible for and unbelievably heavy responsibilities. And they pay a huge price for that because all they do is work. Now, some men in particular, and some women, but a fewer proportion of women, some men are wired like that. And wherever you put them, they're going to work 80 hours a week because they're hyper-conscientious and it's in their nature. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a recipe for a balanced life, even though the rest of us might be reasonably pleased that there are at least some people who are willing to do that. But to think of that as a target for ambition it's just not realistic for the vast majority of people. Who wants that? Why would you want to work 80 hours a week? It's exactly what, I know this. I worked with female lawyers for a decade, high-performing female lawyers. And all of them woke up at 29 or 30 once they'd made partner and thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm working constantly. I mean, the salaries were very good. The level of income was very high, but they were usually married to men who also had very good incomes because those two things tend to correlate very highly. Women generally marry men who have incomes who are higher than theirs. They're thinking, well, how about if I have a life? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. And so, but a lot of it's confusion. But what I also don't understand, especially from the feminists, is that if the goddamn oppressive male patriarchy is such a hellish structure bent on the oppression and domination of everyone in the world, why in the world are women encouraged to flock into it and occupy all the positions of power? That makes no sense to me at all. Is it supposed to be magically transformed in its oppressive nature merely because women happen to be doing exactly the same jobs that men were? Are the women magical in some sense and are going to decrease the degree to which the oppressiveness occurs? There's no evidence for that. That women who have male bosses are happier on average than women who have female bosses. The data, the psychological data on that are quite clear. So there's no evidence that women run more compassionate or efficient organizations than men. And I don't know why you would expect them to, because men and women are more the same than they are different, even though the differences aren't trivial. So, and the idea that there are no differences between men and women, which is the standard social constructionist line, is only indicative of an ignorance of biology that's so profound that it should be criminal. So there's many differences between men and women, and morphologically, physiologically, psychologically, temperamentally, hormonally, developmentally, right from in utero exposure to different sex hormones. And these are not trivial matters, and they have not a determining effect, but a crucial effect. And you see these especially manifested in the extremes, which is why, for example, that the rates of incarceration of men are 10 to 15 times those of women. That's not sociological. It's because there's a small proportion of men who are hyper-aggressive. And you can identify them when they're 2. So, the social constructionists, Judith Butler and people like that, they know absolutely nothing about biology. Nothing. And their ignorance of biology is so profound that they don't even think that they need to know anything about biology because it's not real. It's all a social construct. And it does no one any good. We know in the Scandinavian countries, here's a statistic. The freer the country, the fewer women in the STEM fields. Now explain that. It's easy. If you allow women their choice, they go into professions that care for people. If you allow men their choice, they go into professions that deal with things. And the freer the society, the more that happens. And so the Scandinavians are in this strange position where they've maximally freed their sexes by introducing socially egalitarian legislation. And one of the fundamental consequences is that the differences between men and women in Scandinavia are bigger than they are anywhere else in the world, both in terms of occupational choice and personality. And the Scandinavians have no idea what to do about that. It was a shock to everyone, including the psychologists who discovered it. But what are we going to do? We're going to force little boys and little girls to be exactly the same? We're going to set up a huge bureaucracy to start to hyper-socialize them when they're tiny so that they become identical in every way by the time they're adults? You really think that's going to work? You have to be arrogant beyond conception and cruel to think that such a policy would be either viable or reasonably implemented.